Somewhere in a London publishing house this week, a contract quietly got signed that's about to make William's entire summer considerably harder than it already was.
It's the ultimate betrayal. Prince William's heartbreak today over 3 sickening new revelations, including a tell-all book on his mother, Princess Diana, by his own uncle Earl Spencer.
And here's the part that genuinely catches you off guard. It's not the one you'd actually expect. Charles Spencer, Diana's own brother, just publicly announced he's writing a genuine tell-all memoir about their relationship. 62 years old now, a full 30 years removed from his sister's death, and he's apparently finally, deliberately putting his own complete version of everything down on paper for the world to read. The title alone tells you almost everything about the intended tone. Swan Song, Diana, my sister. Deliberately intimate, deliberately final sounding. The kind of title that signals this is meant to be the definitive word. But that's genuinely only the first thread in a considerably larger tapestry.
He says it's to set the record straight once and for all ahead of the 30th anniversary of her death. Now, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table here. I'm not a big fan of Earl Spencer. I think he has been a malign influence in a lot of ways in recent years, and he has aligned himself very much with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. To me, and this is an opinion, and you are more than welcome to disagree, this is a money play. And it is also a play to make it much easier for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle next year to cash in even further on Princess Diana's memory, because they're like, well, look, Earl Spencer's done this book.
That same general week, separate reports surfaced indicating Charles had personally invited Andrew to Balmoral, the annual summer gathering specifically, the one carrying actual constitutional weight and symbolic significance attached to it within royal circles. Despite what's reportedly been William's own private, direct pushback on the matter behind closed doors. And layered right on top of both of those two developments, there's also a steady, quiet drumbeat building around Harry potentially returning to Britain more regularly going forward, with certain commentary already actively trying to normalize the whole idea before it's even actually happened in any concrete way. 3 genuinely separate threads, all landing within the same few weeks. One very difficult, very taxing summer for a man who's currently spending most of his available energy trying to hold an entire institution together, patiently, for his own eldest son to eventually inherit intact rather than fractured. Let me actually and carefully walk you through what's happening here properly, piece by piece, because there's considerably more texture underneath this than any single headline could ever really capture on its own.
And when it comes to the British monarchy, one of the problems that it has, I think, is the idea that it has a bunch of hangers-on. And the Yorks, of course, are part of that, and Harry and Meghan are part of that as well. And I think it weakens the institution, it weakens what it means to be royalty.
So start with Spencer's announcement specifically, because the timing on this particular piece of news is striking enough on its own to deserve real attention before we move anywhere else. He's framing the book as setting the record straight ahead of the 30th anniversary of Diana's death. His own words describe being inundated with interview requests and finally deciding to write his actual thoughts down, rather than keep reading other people's version of events. There's a genuinely sympathetic version of this whole story worth stating plainly before we get into the more skeptical read, because it deserves fair consideration on its own terms. He was a teenager when he lost his sister to one of the most publicly dissected deaths in modern history. He spent 3 decades watching other people narrate her story. Wanting to finally control that narrative himself, in his own words, is an entirely human impulse. But here's the specific detail actually worth sitting with carefully for a moment before moving forward.
Andrew is very far from being abandoned by his brother. The yawning gap between what the king says and what he does is likely to go down badly with William. You cannot declare your utmost sympathy for the victims and abusers and survivors of abuse with one hand and extend a holiday invitation to your disgraced brother with the other and expect people to understand. The fact that King Charles invited Andrew to Balmoral makes one thing very, very clear. Whatever the press release says, Andrew remains in his brother's eyes family.
Spencer has reportedly spoken before about a private understanding that after the 20th anniversary passed, the family wouldn't keep commercially revisiting Diana's memory around each subsequent milestone, because doing so felt tacky, disrespectful to her actual piece. If that understanding was real, This book represents a fairly direct departure from it. And the timing, dropping right as the 30th anniversary approaches, right when interest and sales potential peak, makes the purely sentimental explanation harder to accept at face value. Worth remembering, too, that this isn't his first deeply personal book. His 2024 memoir detailed genuinely serious, deeply painful abuse he experienced as a child at boarding school, described in real detail across the book. That's real, documented trauma. And it's worth holding that context alongside any skepticism about this new project. Spencer clearly has a track record of processing difficult history through writing, which cuts against reading this purely as opportunism. Still, the specific detail that's landing hardest with critics is what this book reportedly signals for Harry specifically.
Other journalists push the reconciliation narrative, I never will. Harry is dangerous, full stop. I have deep respect for the crown and want to see it thrive forever. Harry is a threat to that. Harry chose to leave. He chose to attack. He stood by while his wife insulted his blood and birthright. He chose to monetize the conflict. He cannot now assume that the institution and people he rejected owes him reconciliation of any kind.
If Spencer, Diana's own brother, a man who's positioned himself for years as protector of her memory, is now cashing in around the 30th anniversary, it becomes considerably easier for Harry and Meghan to justify doing something similar next year. A documentary, more content, another wave of Diana-adjacent material. Spencer, intentionally or not, may have just cleared the path. It's worth pausing here to actually think through what publishing a memoir like this involves practically, because the timing question genuinely cuts both directions once you consider it fully. Publishers plan release dates years in advance around major anniversaries, specifically because that's when public interest peaks. That's simply how the industry works for essentially every historical or biographical release tied to a significant date.
Where Harry's loyalties really lie, and how Earl Spencer, you could say, is encouraging some of this kind of mining of Diana's memory. And I do strongly believe we will probably see a Diana documentary by Harry and Meghan next year. It's the only thing of theirs that they can sell. And so I think that is definitely what they'll be doing. And it's disturbing, but it's unfortunately not a surprise that this is a route that Earl Spencer would decide to go down. And I think he's definitely opened the door for Harry to follow suit.
Reading the 30th anniversary timing as uniquely damning risks ignoring that virtually every book about a major historical figure gets scheduled around meaningful dates precisely because that's when readers actually want to engage with the material. There's also a specific passage reportedly expected in the book, Spencer's own account of introducing Martin Bashir to Diana ahead of the infamous 1995 Panorama interview, the one later confirmed to have been secured through forged documents. Spencer has publicly expressed real regret about that connection before, even drawing a direct line between meeting Bashir and Diana's death 2 years later. That's clearly not a comfortable chapter to revisit, and including it suggests this book actually aims for something more searching than a simple cash grab. So genuinely hold both of these competing realities at once, because that's honestly the more accurate, more complete picture than picking one clean narrative and running with it exclusively.
In some ways, you could say Andrew is looking a gift horse in the mouth here, because actually Charles is risking his relationship with Prince William again, risking his popularity ratings plummeting again, just to align himself with his brother.
A book that may be commercially timed in a way that feels uncomfortable, written by a man who's also clearly still processing real grief and real complicated history. Neither cancels the other out. If this kind of layered breakdown is useful to you, the like button helps this channel keep digging past the surface-level headline version of these stories. Now let's move to the second thread of this whole story, and honestly, this one gets stranger the longer and more carefully you actually sit with it. Reports reportedly surfaced this week that Charles had personally invited Andrew to join the extended family at Balmoral this summer. The actual constitutional gathering, not a casual holiday. According to sources, Andrew reportedly declined, apparently feeling he'd be treated as an outcast if he showed up, that there was nothing left for him to gain by making the trip. Think honestly about how strange that specific detail actually is once you sit with it for even a moment. Andrew turning down an invitation because he'd feel unwelcome isn't really the story. The story is that the invitation existed at all. Because remember what actually happened just months earlier. Andrew's titles were formally stripped. Buckingham Palace released an explicit statement at the time saying those sanctions were necessary, and separately affirming that the king's sympathies remained with victims and survivors of abuse. That was the official position, on record, from the palace itself. So when an invitation to the year's most symbolically loaded family gathering follows shortly after, the same event that traditionally signals who's still inside the family fold, the contradiction becomes hard to look past. You don't get to simultaneously say your thoughts remain with survivors of abuse and also extend a summer holiday invitation to the man those survivors have accused. Those two positions don't sit together comfortably no matter how you frame it. It's worth genuinely sitting with the sheer specificity of that palace statement for a second, because it wasn't vague or softly hedged in any way. It didn't simply say the family was moving forward or focusing generally on healing. It explicitly and deliberately named survivors and victims of abuse as the ongoing priority in writing, released to the entire world through official channels. That's a considerably higher bar to walk back from later than a softer, more ambiguous statement would have been. There's a fair reading here too, honestly. Family relationships don't always follow clean institutional logic. And it's entirely possible Charles is drawing a real distinction between his role as king making formal decisions and his role as an older brother who still loves Andrew regardless of what's happened. People do maintain complicated family relationships with relatives they've publicly distanced themselves from institutionally. That's a real human tension, not necessarily hypocrisy. What genuinely makes it harder to fully accept that more charitable reading, though, is the specific institutional optics attached to Balmoral specifically. Balmoral isn't a private family barbecue. It's reportedly treated as a genuine marker of institutional standing, alongside things like the traditional Christmas walk at Sandringham. Extending that specific invitation isn't a quiet personal gesture. It's a visible, symbolic one, and symbols carry weight in an institution built almost entirely on symbolism. And there's an honestly uncomfortable question sitting quietly underneath all of it. One nobody's managed to fully answer yet. If Andrew's welcome back at Balmoral this summer, is he showing up at Sandringham for Christmas too? Because that's apparently where this specific trajectory logically leads, and nobody's offered a clear answer either way. Worth being genuinely fair to Charles here on one more specific front too, before moving forward into the third thread of tonight's story. Leading an institution while also being a father and a brother is a really difficult balancing act that doesn't have a clean textbook answer. Every choice he makes gets read simultaneously as a personal decision and an institutional one, and it's entirely possible no single decision could satisfy both roles perfectly at once. That's a real bind. Not necessarily evidence of poor judgment, but the specific pattern here does genuinely raise a fair, recurring question about basic consistency in how this entire situation has been publicly handled. Andrew was reportedly welcomed back into family gatherings before, then pulled back when public pressure intensified, and now there's this renewed invitation. If that back and forth keeps repeating, it suggests less a clear strategy and more an ongoing unresolved tension that never actually gets settled, which arguably does more long-term damage to public trust than a single firm decision in either direction would. Now let's turn to the third and final thread running through all of this, and this one's genuinely less about any single dramatic event and considerably more about a slow, building narrative playing out across weeks. There's been a steady flow of commentary lately suggesting Harry's return to Britain should simply be accepted, treated as inevitable, framed warmly regardless of the history behind it. Not everyone's buying that framing though. Some commentators have pushed back directly, arguing that stepping back from royal duties, publicly criticizing the institution at length, and profiting significantly from that criticism doesn't automatically entitle someone to a clean, uncomplicated reconciliation whenever they decide they want one. That's a genuinely fair position worth taking seriously on its own terms, entirely separate from whatever personal view you might hold about whether Harry deserves forgiveness eventually, or on what timeline. The specific argument isn't that reconciliation should never happen. It's that reconciliation without any acknowledgement of the underlying conflict tends to just paper over real tension rather than actually resolving it. And papering over tension has a way of resurfacing later, usually at a worse moment than if it had been addressed directly the first time. There's also a genuinely fair counterpoint worth including here, honestly, before wrapping up this specific thread. Families do reconcile without perfect formal acknowledgement of every specific grievance all the time. Sometimes relationships do improve gradually through repeated contact and time passing, without anyone ever delivering a clean, satisfying apology that checks every box. Demanding a particular kind of acknowledgement before accepting any reconciliation as legitimate risks setting a bar that very few real families, royal or otherwise, could actually clear. So where does all of this genuinely leave things for William specifically, given that he's sitting quietly at the center of every single one of these three separate threads simultaneously, whether he wants to be or not? He's reportedly watching his own uncle prepare to profit from a chapter of family history that was supposedly settled as off-limits after the 20th anniversary. He's reportedly watching his father extend an olive branch to Andrew that directly complicates the institution's own public commitments to abuse survivors. And he's reportedly watching a broader media narrative quietly build toward normalizing Harry's return, without much apparent appetite for addressing what actually caused the rift in the first place. None of these three things individually proves anything catastrophic. People write memoirs for complicated reasons. Family members extend invitations for complicated reasons. Media narratives shift gradually for all sorts of reasons that don't require any grand coordinated explanation. But taken together, across a single summer, they do paint a picture of an institution where William's own stated preferences for consistency, for consequences that actually stick, for genuine accountability before reconciliation, keep apparently getting set aside in favor of Charles's more sentimental family-first instincts. Whether that specific pattern reflects poor institutional judgment or simply reflects a father genuinely trying to hold together a complicated, fractured family under absolutely enormous public scrutiny, probably depends heavily on which specific decision you happen to be examining and how much benefit of the doubt you're personally inclined to extend on any given day. There's a broader tension worth naming here too, one that extends well beyond just this specific summer. Every modern monarchy eventually faces some version of this exact same question. How much does personal, private family loyalty get to override institutional consistency? And at what point does that private loyalty start actively undermining the institution's own public credibility? Different royal households across Europe have handled versions of this tension very differently over the decades. Some leaning hard into strict institutional consistency at real personal cost. Others prioritizing family unity even when it created genuine public friction. There's no single obviously correct answer here, which is exactly what makes William's position, watching all of this unfold from close range, genuinely difficult rather than simply frustrating. Before we close out tonight's breakdown, one considerably lighter note genuinely worth including, because honestly, not everything this particular week was tension and complicated family politics. Princess Eugenie announced the arrival of her daughter, Adelaide Elizabeth Anina Brooksbank, sharing both the full name and an actual clear photograph of the baby's face. Without any of the partial cover framing, deliberate angle choices, or delayed name reveal secrecy that's genuinely become fairly common practice elsewhere across this same family in recent years, for reasons that have never been entirely explained publicly. She specifically noted that the middle name honors her late grandmother directly, and described the full name as reflecting both English and Portuguese heritage. Two places, according to her own words, that she and her husband genuinely consider home in different ways. It's worth noting, too, that this continues a pattern visible across nearly every female descendant in this particular generation, with Elizabeth appearing repeatedly as a middle name choice, a quiet, consistent thread connecting the newest arrivals back to their great-grandmother across the entire extended family. It genuinely read, by most accounts, as a warm, entirely straightforward moment. No calculated ambiguity, no manufactured mystery, just a family sharing real, uncomplicated joy, after what's reportedly been a genuinely difficult stretch for Eugenie personally over recent months. Worth noting simply for what it is. A nice contrast to how complicated and combative most of this family's public moments have become lately. So where does all of this actually leave things heading into the remainder of what's shaping up to be a genuinely eventful summer? Spencer's book reportedly lands next month, and how honestly it actually handles the more genuinely difficult, uncomfortable chapters of his relationship with Diana. The panorama connection specifically, any real tension between them in her final years, will say a considerable amount about whether this project was truly about setting the historical record straight for its own sake, or something considerably closer to timing a commercial release around a moment of guaranteed peak public interest. There's also the genuine question of how Harry and Meghan respond, if at all, once the book actually publishes. Given the reported history here, the pattern of one family member's disclosure seeming to open space for another's, it wouldn't be surprising if Spencer's memoir becomes at least partial justification for whatever project the Sussexes have reportedly been quietly developing around the same anniversary. Whether that's a documentary, an interview, or something else entirely remains to be seen. But the timing alignment across multiple family members releasing Diana-adjacent content within the same 18-month window feels considerably harder to read as pure coincidence. Andrew's Balmoral situation remains genuinely unresolved too. Declined this time around, but with the invitation itself already having done whatever symbolic work it was always going to do, entirely regardless of whether he actually showed up in person. And the slow, steady drumbeat around Harry's potential return keeps building in the background, with no clear indication yet of what actual accountability, if any, comes attached to it. What do you honestly think? Does Spencer's upcoming memoir genuinely read to you as an authentic reckoning with his sister's complicated legacy, something he needed to write for his own sake after decades of silence? Or does the specific 30th anniversary timing make the more cynical, commercially minded reading genuinely harder to dismiss, no matter how sympathetic his personal history clearly is? And separately, on Andrew specifically, does extending that Balmoral invitation genuinely undermine the palace's own explicit written statement about supporting abuse survivors, or is family loyalty simply its own separate, legitimate category of human relationship that doesn't necessarily have to align perfectly with formal institutional statements every single time, even when the optics look genuinely uncomfortable from the outside? Let me know your honest take on all of this down in the comments below. I read every single one, and they genuinely help shape which stories we decide to dig into next. And if you want more careful breakdowns exactly like this one, the kind that actually try to hold multiple sides of a complicated family story fairly in view rather than just picking whichever version generates the most outrage, go ahead and subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss the next one whenever it drops. A like on your way out genuinely helps too, more than you'd probably think for a channel still finding its footing.